So, Ed, we were talking earlier about the flying triangle and, the some of the technology. So did you ever sort of hear anything about that technology elsewhere, the gravity warping technology, or however you might describe it? Did you ever hear about any other stories about that?
It was quite interesting because it came in pieces, and we've talked about the 5 close friends I had for 20, 30 years that referred me to other friends, and we were told that the TR-3B might have stood for tactical reconnaissance, which never made sense because tactical reconnaissance just doesn't seem to be a role for that type of vehicle. And then other people said it was Teledyne Ryan. The TR and TR-3B was Teledyne Ryan, which I think is part of Northrop Boeing. But I was introduced to a gentleman that was, his name was Larry, and he was he was going on 70 when I was about in the early 90s when I started doing the research and interviewing people. And he told me about when he was a kid, physicist right out of MIT, and he had worked up at, I believe it was Gravity Ran there at near Carswell Air Force Base. And he told me this story that when he first went to work for Gravity Ran, that they were getting technology in there and trying to understand how it worked. And he said he was led to believe that it was foreign technology. So he thought, well, okay, it's the Russians or Japanese or Germans or some of these top secret scientific developments. And they were literally basically back engineering, which most people call reverse engineering nowadays. And it came to the point to where the advances in technology, science and electronics, physics that they were finding out made no sense to him, that it had to be far better than anybody he could conceive of on Earth actually building some of these pieces of equipment or technology. So he worked for this older scientist that was in charge of him, and he reported to, and finally he got so frustrated he blew up to the scientist. He says, this is all bullshit. He says, the Japanese can't be making this, or the Russians, or the Chinese. He says, this, I don't even know how this can be made on Earth. And the old scientist, told him, he said, you just answered your own question. And after that, the old scientist apparently had been involved with this from about 49 or 50, which puts you kind of in the timeline of Colonel Corso and Eisenhower staff talking about revealing bits and pieces of recovered UFO material and seeding it out to universities and industry to try to develop it or understand it. So it fit perfectly with the story. He said at one point they had developed this torus, and he also said it had something to do with the mercury. Now, I had a lot of physicists tell me long stories, and I'm not a physicist. The only physics I understand is basically the type you would use in electronics engineering. So when they talk about different propulsion systems or exotic materials or what we now call metamaterials, I didn't have a clue what they were talking about. I just picked up different terms, and that was basically it. But he said they built this torus, and they figured this thing would reverse gravity. So they had this massive torus that was about, I think, 10 feet tall and probably about 50 feet across. It looks like basically a huge inner tube or donut, and it's filled with some type of gases or ions. And they had this thing chained down with these huge chains to the concrete because they didn't know if this thing was going to explode or go through the floor or go through the ceiling. of this warehouse, and they turned it on with all this massive voltage and amperage, and it didn't do anything. And it spent huge amounts of money, and then somebody had the, I guess just common sense, went up and you could see the chains were taut. And then they measured the actual weight. They turned it off, they retested it, and they measured the weight of the torus with it turned on, and found out that they had reduced gravity about 89-90%. So then I asked him, I said, well, how would you go from a torus, which sounds like maybe a UFO propulsion device, to a triangle? And he says, well, if you can reduce weight but you don't have 100% lift or 100% anti-gravity, he says you put the torus in a massive vehicle that's triangular shape, and you use advanced propulsion systems on each corner of the triangle to give you the lift and steer it, but you're only lifting 10 or 11% of the mass and the weight. So it made perfect sense to me why they actually had to develop some type of gravity warping, or anti-gravity is actually a popular term, but it's not a real term scientists would use. But they had to develop some type of gravity lift or gravity warping. Otherwise, why would they put it in a fixed cough drop, triangular shape, massive vehicle that has no aerodynamic qualities at all?
Yeah, that's it. And I think that time frame that you mentioned as well, I mean, I don't think we've spoken about this, but the Project Winterhaven, which was the Thomas Townsend Brown proposal, I think, which was mid-50s, I think, it's alleged that around about 1956, a lot of the anti-gravity research went black, and in the white world it was just all regarded as nonsense from that point forward. And that's that time frame, I think, at least to me at least, ties in with the sort of timescales you were just talking about.
You're absolutely right. Like, what was amazing to me is with the advent of the internet, Google, I started researching basically gravity research back after World War II, and obviously after Roswell. And there was massive investments, numerous companies getting funded by the Department of Defense to work on gravity engineering, or gravity nullification, or gravity as a propulsive tool. And there were front page headlines every major city about gravity breakthroughs or anti-gravity vehicles in the near future. I mean, it was way out in the open. And, major companies were saying, well, we're near breakthroughs, or we've just made some breakthroughs that are paying off. And then all of a sudden, like you said, about mid-50s, Convair, Gravity Ran, all these corporations, and they just went totally silent on the issue.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, I think it's just symptomatic of what was going on. People pulling the strings behind the scenes, so to speak, to allow them to do their own research in secret. That's what it seemed like to me, and I think everything ties up with that.
If they had a breakthrough in the mid-50s, that's almost 60 years ago. It's about 58, 59 years ago. I mean, it's just incredible. And then you've got the Bell that used a mercury, either plasma or fluid, that the Germans were developing. It's right. One of the most top secret research right before the end of World War II. And then you had all the paperclip scientists and officers that came over to the U.S., and obviously, I mean, it would seem to me like they continued doing the research, and between having one or two down and recovered alien saucers or whatever they were. And then you've got all these German scientists that had getting ready to make breakthroughs in gravity. It's very possible that 90% of the UFOs we've seen since then might have been made on Earth.
Quite so. One thing I was going to add to the discussion there was I did have some communication with Nick Cook, the Jane's Defence journalist. I don't know if you ever had any contact with Nick Cook. I'm sure you've heard of him.
Oh, way back in the day.
Yeah. He wrote that book, The Hunt for Zero Point, which I think was published in year 2000, I think. So it's, again, getting on for 13, 14 years old now. And basically, he said the same, but when I last heard from him, or when I last heard of him on the internet, he seemed to be going back on his original research, and he was claiming that the site that he'd been shown in, which used to be in Poland, or was in Germany for a while, the one that's where they had the underground facilities in Germany, which was alleged to be where they were working on the Bell. Nick Cook went back on that research, and he said he didn't think that thing was for testing an anti-gravity propulsion system after all. That the fly trap, they called it, that circular structure that had the pillars. You're probably familiar with that story. He's now gone back on that, and the last I heard, he was kind of it's almost like he'd been warned off, and he doesn't seem to have said much in the last 7 years or so. So I don't know if he's felt that it's become a bit too much of a hot area for him to put out now.
He can take it all back, but it's irrefutable that the Germans did have what they called the Bell, and they were trying to develop exotic propulsion, and it did use some form of mercury, whether, like I said, it was a fluid or a plasma, and the fly trap, it would have been a perfect setup for testing the vehicle above ground. So, I mean, people can take stuff back if it's no longer in favor to them personally, or if they've got some agenda. But the fact remains is there's a lot of scientists that believe it's what it's purported to be.
And any thoughts for the future then? Do you have any particular thoughts about, do you think that things are the same now as they were, 10 years ago? Do you think more people are receptive to the sorts of things that you've been saying, or less receptive, or, what are your thoughts on that sort of thing?
Well, I talk about things like quasi-crystals and metamaterials and certain fields of science that were unpopular, or people like Daniel Sheckman lost his job. He was a very respected physicist, and he lost his job pursuing quasi-crystals, and he was very unpopular for a number of years. And specifically, when I was talking about quasi-crystals in the early 90s and came out and talked about them in 98, he was still very unpopular, and he was pretty much laughed at. So if some people have said, well, I just looked it up in literature, well, why would I pick a hypothesis that was extremely unpopular amongst fellow scientists, his peers, to promote? And then 2 years ago, he got the Nobel Prize in chemistry for quasi-crystals. So either I was psychic or I knew what I was talking about.